21:17 in the evening. According to multiple circulating sources within Nigeria's entertainment circles, Jide Kosoko, now 72, is reportedly facing the final stage of a dangerous cancer, a condition described by some as life-threatening, fragile, and unfolding far faster than anyone expected. The atmosphere turns heavy almost instantly. A phone vibrates continuously on a wooden table, messages piling up unread, a glass of water left untouched, now cold. And somewhere in the silence, a question lingers. What really happened to the man who once seemed unbreakable? In those first moments, the feeling of pain begins to creep in, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Those close to him, according to sources, had already noticed small changes weeks earlier. A slower step, a longer pause before speaking, the way his eyes would drift as if searching for something beyond the room. But no one imagined it would lead here. The timeline begins to piece itself together. Late nights, quiet hospital visits, whispers among colleagues who chose not to speak publicly. And at the center of it all, Henrietta Kosoko, his wife, is said to have been the one holding everything together. Yet even she, according to those nearby, could not hide the pain etched across her face. There are reports of her sitting beside his bed, fingers tightly wrapped around his hand as machines hummed softly in the background. Moments where words failed, replaced only by silence, heavy enough to suffocate. Some claim she tried to remain strong in front of others, offering a composed smile, but the moment she turned away, the weight of loss seemed to crash down all at once. The story deepens, as more details surface. Fragments of conversations, glimpses of hospital corridors lit by cold fluorescent light, the faint echo of footsteps at midnight. It is said that Jide Kosoko himself remained unusually calm, almost distant, as if aware of something others were not ready to accept. A man who had spent decades in the spotlight now facing a reality that no audience could soften. The contrast is striking, almost unbearable. The laughter from past performances still echoing in memory, colliding with the quiet, sterile atmosphere of a hospital room. And then there are the small details, the kind that linger. A folded piece of cloth left on a chair, a script he never finished reading, a phone call that went unanswered, each one carrying a weight far beyond its simplicity. Henrietta, according to close observers, began to withdraw from public view. Her voice, once steady, now barely above a whisper. There are mentions of nights where she remained awake, watching over him, as if afraid that closing her eyes for even a moment might change everything. The pain here is no longer subtle. It grows, layer by layer, pressing in from every direction. And yet, amidst all this, questions continue to rise. Was there a moment when things could have been different? Did the signs appear earlier than anyone realized? Or was this an inevitable path? One that had been quietly forming long before the world took notice. As the timeline moves forward, the intensity begins to shift, the chaos of the initial shock slowly giving way to something quieter, heavier. Acceptance, perhaps, or something close to it. The hospital room becomes a world of its own, time moving differently inside, each second stretching longer than the last. Outside, life continues, unaware, indifferent. Inside, every breath carries meaning. Henrietta is said to have leaned closer at times, whispering words no one else could hear. Words filled with pain, with love, with a desperate hope that somehow things might turn back. But the silence that followed each whisper seemed to say otherwise. And then, in one of those still moments, no cameras, no audience, no noise, just the faint glow of a dim light casting shadows across the room. Jide Kosoko lies there, unmoving, while Henrietta sits beside him, her hand still holding his, her eyes fixed on his face as if trying to memorize every detail. And on a small table nearby, the phone continues to vibrate softly. Message after message, unanswered, as the night slowly deepens and the silence grows heavier than ever before. The timeline quietly rewinds, back to days that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. Jide Kosoko was still appearing in public, still stepping onto sets, still exchanging greetings with the same familiar warmth. But according to multiple sources, something had already begun to shift beneath that surface. A fatigue that lingered longer than usual. A heaviness in his movements that no one could quite explain. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Just exhaustion, perhaps. Age catching up. Maybe. But then the small details started to gather, slowly forming a pattern that could no longer be ignored. There were moments, they say, when he would fall into unusual silence, standing among colleagues, yet somehow distant, as if his thoughts had drifted far beyond the room. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly now paused midway, leaving an uncomfortable gap. A look in his eyes, faint, unfocused, like a light dimming little by little. One particular filming day, often mentioned in whispers, was reportedly interrupted without clear explanation. Cameras paused, crew members exchanging uncertain glances, and Jide Kosoko, once known for his strong presence, was said to have stepped away quietly, without the usual energy that defined him. It was subtle, almost invisible to those not paying close attention, but to those who knew him well, it felt different, unsettling. Colleagues, according to insiders, began to notice these changes first. Small exchanges behind the scenes, quiet concerns shared in corners of dressing rooms. "He doesn't look like himself," one was said to have murmured, while another reportedly brushed it off, unwilling to believe that anything serious could be happening. But the unease remained, growing, spreading quietly. And then there were the fans, the ones who had followed his journey for decades. Some claim they began to sense it too, not through official statements, but through brief appearances, short clips, moments where something felt off. A smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. A pause that lasted just a second too long. The kind of details that only those who truly pay attention would catch. And yet, even then, no one spoke openly. Everything remained in the realm of speculation. According to sources, it is believed. Some have noticed. Phrases that hovered without confirmation, but carried a weight of their own. As the days moved forward, the situation reportedly escalated in silence. Hospital visits began, not publicly announced, not openly acknowledged, just quiet entries through side doors, late hours, minimal attention, a pattern that suggested urgency yet avoided scrutiny. Those close to him, it is said, tried to keep things contained, protecting his privacy, shielding the reality from spreading too soon. But inside those walls, something far more serious was unfolding. The word treatment started to appear in hushed conversations, followed by longer pauses, heavier sighs, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the sense of loss began to take shape. Not as a sudden blow, but as a slow realization creeping in, the kind that builds over time, refusing to be ignored. Henrietta, according to those who observed her during this period, was already carrying that weight, even before anything was confirmed. There are mentions of her arriving quietly, leaving even more quietly, her face composed, yet her eyes revealing a storm she could not fully hide. Moments where she would stand still for a few seconds longer than necessary, as if bracing herself before moving again. And in those small, almost invisible gestures, the truth seemed to whisper its way into reality. The timeline continues to tighten, each day bringing with it more uncertainty, more unanswered questions, until the ordinary can no longer be maintained. until the illusion of normality begins to crack. And just before everything shifts completely, there is a lingering thought, almost too heavy to confront, but impossible to ignore. Because perhaps the most painful part was never just the illness itself. The focus shifts quietly, almost gently, away from the noise of speculation and into a much smaller, more intimate space. A hospital room dimly lit, where time seems to slow down. And there, beside the bed, sits Henrietta Kosoko. According to those who have seen her in these moments, she does not speak much. She does not need to. Her presence alone carries a weight that words could never fully express. Her hands are said to remain tightly wrapped around his, fingers interlocked as if holding on to something slipping away. And yet if one looks closely, there is a slight tremble, subtle, almost invisible, but enough to reveal the storm beneath her composure. On a small table nearby, a crumpled tissue lies forgotten, its edges soft from being held too long, too tightly. Next to it, a family photograph, one that captures a different time, a different reality, smiles frozen in a moment that now feels painfully distant. The faint glow of hospital lights casts long shadows across the room, creating an atmosphere that feels both still and unbearably heavy. According to sources, Henrietta may have known about the seriousness of his condition long before it became a whisper among others. There are suggestions that she had been quietly preparing herself, piece by piece, for a truth she hoped would never fully arrive. And yet, despite that awareness, she is said to have maintained a calm exterior, greeting visitors with quiet strength, answering questions with measured words, never allowing the full extent of her fear to surface. But in the spaces between those moments, when no one else is watching, the reality begins to seep through. There are reports of her sitting motionless for long periods, eyes fixed on him, as if memorizing every detail, every breath, every slight movement, as though afraid that looking away, even for a second, might mean losing something forever. The emotional tension rises, not through loud expressions, but through what remains unsaid. Tears, according to those present, do not fall dramatically. They gather slowly, lingering at the edge of her eyes, refusing to drop, as if even they are hesitant to break the fragile silence. This is where pain takes on a different form, no longer sharp and sudden, but deep, steady, consuming, intertwined with a growing sense of loss that cannot yet be fully acknowledged. Because to acknowledge it would make it real, and reality, in this moment, feels unbearable. There are whispers that she leans closer at times, her voice barely audible, words meant only for him, words that carry years of shared memories, unspoken fears, and a love that now stands face to face with something it cannot fight. And still, she remains, holding on, staying present, refusing to let go even as everything around her begins to change. The room itself becomes a witness, silent, unyielding, absorbing every glance, every breath, every unspoken thought. And within that silence, a truth begins to form, quiet, yet impossible to ignore. Because there are pains that do not need to be spoken, and still are enough to shatter a heart into pieces. The space narrows again, now fully contained within the cold, clinical walls of the hospital, where every sound carries weight. The steady rhythm of machines echoes through the room, each beep marking time in a way that feels both precise and cruel. Tubes, wires, the faint hiss of oxygen flowing through a breathing apparatus, all of it forming a fragile line between presence and absence. According to multiple sources, his condition is believed to have deteriorated rapidly during this period. What once seemed manageable began to slip beyond control, and yet no official words were spoken. Only silence, heavy, deliberate silence, from the doctors, who reportedly spoke less with each passing hour, their expressions growing more serious, their pauses longer, their answers more measured, as if every word now carried consequences too great to risk. Outside the room, the family waited, not with loud cries or visible panic, but with a quiet tension that stretched endlessly. Eyes fixed on the closed door, hands clasped tightly, breaths shallow and uneven, waiting, always waiting. Time, in this place, no longer moved forward. It circled, repeated, refused to pass. And beyond those walls, another layer unfolded. Fans, scattered across cities and screens, began to share fragments of information, posts, messages, rumors spreading faster than confirmation. According to sources, it is believed. Phrases repeated again and again, building a storm of uncertainty that no one could fully control. The pressure mounted from every direction. And then came the details that would later linger in memory. A phone call in the middle of the night. Sudden, unexpected, breaking through the fragile stillness. Voices lowered, urgent, incomplete. Footsteps rushing down a dim corridor. The kind of movement that signals something has changed. Something irreversible. A door, heavy, sterile, closing with a finality that felt louder than any alarm, sealing off the space between those inside and those left waiting outside. The pacing quickens now, each moment stacking on top of the next. No time to breathe, no time to process. Just a relentless climb toward something no one dares to name. Inside, it is said, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The machines, once steady, began to fluctuate. The silence between sounds growing longer, more ominous. Doctors moving with increased urgency, yet speaking even less. Gestures replacing words. Glances exchanged that said more than explanations ever could. This is where pain reaches its peak. Not in loud expressions, but in the unbearable weight of uncertainty. In the realization that control is slipping away. That time, once taken for granted, has now become the most unforgiving enemy. Henrietta, according to those nearby, remained close, closer than before, as if distance itself had become unacceptable. Her hand still holding his, her presence unwavering, even as everything else began to falter. There are whispers that she called his name softly, again and again, not in panic, but in a quiet plea that carried everything she could not say out loud. And then, in the middle of all that movement, all that tension, there came a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, where everything seemed to pause. The machines, the voices, the footsteps, as if the world itself had taken a breath and refused to release it. And in that suspended second, something changed. Something no one could fully explain, because there are moments when time does not just pass, it stops, and then, almost imperceptibly, the intensity begins to fade. Not because the situation has changed, but because there is simply no more energy left to resist it. The hospital no longer feels like a place of urgency, but a space suspended in stillness, where even the machines seem quieter, softer, as if aware that something irreversible has already taken hold. The voices that once filled the corridors are gone, replaced by a silence that stretches endlessly, heavy, unbroken. Inside the room, nothing moves quickly anymore. Every gesture slows. Every breath carries a weight that cannot be ignored. Henrietta remains there, still beside him. But now her stillness feels different. Less like resistance. More like acceptance beginning to settle in, quietly, painfully. Her hand no longer trembles as before. It simply rests in his, as if holding on has become something deeper than fear. something beyond words. The story, once filled with motion and urgency, now turns inward, into memory, into reflection. Because when everything else falls away, what remains are the fragments of a life once lived in full light. Jide Kosoko, a man whose name had echoed across stages and screens for decades, whose performances once brought laughter, emotion, presence, now reduced to a quiet figure in a dim room. And yet, those memories linger, vivid, untouchable, scenes from films, lines once spoken with strength, moments that defined an entire career. They begin to resurface, not loudly, but like distant echoes that refuse to disappear. Outside, the world continues to react. Fans express their sorrow, their disbelief, messages filled with longing, with regret, with questions that no one can answer. Is it true? How did it come to this? The media, too, continues its quiet pursuit, piecing together timelines, searching for clarity in a situation that offers none. But inside this space, none of that noise seems to matter anymore, because here, everything has slowed to a single fragile reality. There is a chair, empty now, slightly pushed back as if someone had just stood up and never returned. There is a room, once filled with quiet conversations, now holding only silence, the kind of silence that feels almost physical, pressing against the walls, settling into every corner, and within that silence, the sense of loss becomes clearer, not as a sudden realization, but as something that has been forming all along, now impossible to deny. Time continues to move, but no longer with urgency, only with quiet inevitability, and in that fading light, with memories lingering in the air and silence stretching endlessly, what remains is not the noise of what happened, but the quiet absence of what once was. Night slowly falls. Not suddenly, but in a quiet, almost unnoticeable way. The light inside the hospital room fades until only a dim glow remains, soft, fragile, barely enough to hold back the darkness pressing in from every corner. The machines continue their steady rhythm, but now they sound distant, as if coming from somewhere far away, on the small table beside the bed. The same family photograph still rests where it has always been, untouched, unchanged. Yet somehow everything within it feels impossibly far. The smiles captured in that frame now belong to another time, another world, one that seems to be slipping further out of reach with every passing second. Henrietta Kosoko sits there, unmoving, her figure almost blending into the shadows, her eyes fixed on the bed in front of her, not searching, not questioning, just watching, as if trying to hold on to something that cannot be held. She does not speak. There are no more words left to say, only silence. Deep, consuming silence, and on the bed, Jide Kosoko lies there, still, suspended in that fragile space between what is and what may no longer be. According to those who have witnessed moments like this, it is a place where time no longer feels real, where seconds stretch endlessly, where every breath carries uncertainty, and yet nothing moves, nothing changes. Outside, the world continues, unaware, distant. But inside this room, everything feels suspended, waiting, as if the night itself is holding its breath. And in that quiet, fading light, with shadows growing longer and the silence settling deeper, no one knows what will happen next.